Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Welcome everyone. My words today are going to be somewhat brief, just for a few minutes, if you'll bear with me. What I'm going to talk about very briefly today is what is the meaning of knowing God? And for people who have attended my pravachans in the past, you know that very often I talk about I talk about how to know God. That's not what I'm going to be speaking about today. Rather, I'm going to talk about what it means to know God. And this is going to be very much in relation to the wonderful Satyanarayana Puja that took place today. As we know, with the Satyanarayana Puja, it is a puja in which we meditate upon the divine, in which we invoke Sriman Narayana, God himself. But it's also a puja in which we hear many wonderful stories about God. Well, what is the purpose of both puja as well as katha, these various stories that we hear? There is a purpose behind them. And that purpose is very specifically to have an experience of the divine, to understand what it means to be in the presence of God. Now, let me start my talk by first just telling everyone a very quick little story, true story. Once, this was maybe 8-9 years ago or so, I was in New York and I was appearing on a TV show. And this was a show in which we were talking about Hinduism. And it was a call-in show. And people were calling in, asking me various questions. And it was very interesting. This one person called toward the end, and he asked me this question. He said, sir, this is very nice. You seem to know a lot about Hinduism, but can you please explain to me, how can we know God? How do you know God? Can you prove that God exists? Now, at this point, I had 60 seconds left of this show. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, this person wants proof of God's existence in 60 seconds or less. And I thought about it for a moment, and this is what I said to him. I said, well, sir, you see, this is the problem. Yes, I can prove that God exists. Can't do it in 60 seconds, but I can prove that God exists. However, let me say that you are possibly an atheist. And if I were to somehow come up with the most perfect description of God's existence, the most perfect philosophical, logical proof for God's existence that is so rigid in its logic, that is so economical in its form, that is so perfect a proof of God's existence, that anyone who saw this very short sentence would have to say, oh my, God does exist. Let's say I were to come up with such a proof. Now, if I were to show such a proof to the typical atheist, and if they were to see this proof and say, oh, okay, I guess philosophically I was wrong. I guess God does exist. Now, if this were an intelligent atheist, his next question should be this. All right, God does exist. So what? So what? In other words, we may be able to come to some philosophical or intellectual understanding of the divine. But does that really affect who and what we are within? Does it actually have meaning for our lives personally? And the truth of the matter is it doesn't. Because how many people are there who indeed believe in God but live as if God does not exist? Theoretically, they accept that, oh yes, there's a God, I believe in God. However, by their behavior, you wouldn't know so. So what's more important than simply having an intellectual grasp of the divine is to have an experience of that divine. When it comes to the idea of knowing God, this is the difficulty, is that what it means to know anything is that that thing that we are knowing is an object. You know? How do I know that there's a piece of paper here? Well, it's an object for me. It's an object of my knowledge. It's something that I can hold in my hands. Now, this is the difficulty. God is not an object. God is a subject. Now, what's the difference between the two? Well, this is the difference. How many of us have someone in our life who we love? I won't ask people to raise their hands because everyone does. Now, this is the question. That person you love, is that person an object? No. Do you treat that person as an object? No, at least you shouldn't. Rather, you understand that that person you love, whether it's your mother, your father, your wife, your husband, your child, that person is a subject, not an object. And thus, accordingly, you treat that person as a subject. Now, what does it mean to be a subject? It means that you will never know that person entirely unless that person chooses to reveal themselves to you. Is that not the case? How many people have we had in our lives? Again, mother, father, husband, wife, anyone, friend, who we have loved, but who we cannot say 100% that yes, we know them thoroughly. Rather, it is in accordance with how much we treat them as a person, as a subject, that they reveal themselves to us. We must approach subject as subject. In the same way, when we approach God, if we see God as a thing, if we see God as a mathematical equation, if we see God as merely some empirical phenomena which we are to use as our object, then we'll never know God. In the same way that we wouldn't know someone we love if we treated them the same way. Rather, we are to ourselves be a subject facing the divine subject. And in this way, through love, with consciousness, accessing consciousness, in this way we can have direct experience of the divine. And in this way, more than simply understanding theoretically that God exists, God becomes a living presence in our lives. In the same way that anyone we love is a living presence in our lives. Again, if there's someone you love, that is not simply a dead theory. That is a living presence that is there in your life. God too will be that living presence if we open ourselves to this divine subject. With that, I thank you very much. Namaskar.